I wanted to start with just highlighting how much change and progress is really possible in education. Singapore is a country that reminds us of this. When Singapore became independent in the 1960s, they had 2% of the adult workforce being able to read and write. And they learned a lot from education systems around the world, including England. Today they're at the top of the league tables, and the world can learn a lot from them. I mean, it shows us really the amount of change that's possible. Another thing I think we can learn from Singapore is that you don't have to change everything to make some things better. I think they have been very systematic in their approaches to educational reform and change, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learning from this. This is the map that you have probably seen in one of the other ways. On the vertical axis, you see the performance of education systems in terms of learning outcomes. On the horizontal axis, you see the achievement gap, the impact that social background has on learning outcomes. And everybody wants to be in the upper right quadrant where outcomes are strong and learning opportunities are equitably distributed. The temptation always is to think, we just throw more money into the system. No. But actually, if you look at the impact of spending, the dots have now become proportional to the amount of money that is being spent per student. You find that relationship actually remarkably weak. Spending per student explains about 15% of the performance variation of education systems, both in terms of the quality of learning outcomes and equity. So the reform needs to be more than about resources. And actually, one country that always reminds us of this is Luxembourg, the big red dot, the most expensive education system. They're doing neither well in terms of the quality of learning outcomes, nor have they achieved a reasonably equitable distribution of learning opportunities. And the UK comes out sort of in the middle. It's not investing a lot in its education, but it's investing pretty much as other people do. Some people who see this say, well, this is not about reform, this is about culture, context. Some systems are just easier to manage than others. But if that would be true, or the whole answer, you would see actually this picture year after year, decade after decade. And actually, I just want to highlight a few things that you can actually see in terms of changes. I want to focus your attention on Chile down there and Turkey down there in 2003. Both were investing a lot in education reform. And Chile was actually able to move upwards. You can see that there. But in the same time, Turkey moved up, both in terms of improving learning outcomes and closing a lot of the achievement gap. And this shows us really, two countries starting at the same point, ending up in quite different parts of the equation. You can see other countries as well, Shanghai improving, or again, this is also a lesson. Singapore is doing really well today, but they keep improving. The frontier is moving ahead as well. You can see Germany moving up and to the right side. You can see Italy moving upwards. You can see Poland, dramatic improvement in the quality of learning outcomes, or Portugal. A lot of change across a reasonably short period of history, and that shows really improvement. Rapid improvement is actually quite possible, but it's not universal. There's actually also some disappointing stories. I want to highlight the example of Sweden. That is where you used to see Sweden, and that's where you see Sweden now. Fortunately, there are not many countries with negative trends, but there are some, and I think we can learn as much from them as we learn from the improvers. But I want to highlight one message, actually. When I talk about reform later on, one thing that I think gets often overlooked in the context of the UK is that actually the share of the performance variation that lies between schools in England and the UK is actually quite small. Most of the performance gap that you can see actually lies within schools. It's the white bar that is very long. And that makes it really, really hard. If you could if you were in a country like this, Hungary, Belgium, Germany, and so on, Netherlands, you can just pinpoint the schools that are in difficulty, fix them, and you have improved your outcomes. The UK has invested a lot in doing these kind of things, focusing on schools as the unit. But actually what you see from this chart is the bigger challenge for you lies in the within-school variability. There are many schools in many neighborhoods, rich and poor, with large performance deficiencies, large weaknesses. So you have to actually, if you want to make reform successful, you can't get to a few schools, you need to get to many schools in many areas. Some of the schools in wealthy neighborhoods, and that's actually a quite surprising finding, at least to our analysis, do not do as well as you expect them to do. No? They have a big advantage. They get the students with a lot of support from parents and families and so on, and still the value add is not as great as you expect. So the within-school performance variation, I think as well, reform really needs to focus after a lot of progress has been achieved to deal with the between-school components. So much of my talk is really about that. I'll also highlight one thing that is important. I think the UK, England has seen enormous progress in sort of strengthening local leadership initiative. I've been very impressed by the rapid growth of academies. I think that's been really something that gave schools much better tools to take on their own future. At the very same time, what our data also show is that there are actually two things that belong together. One is local initiative, and the other is a very strong system that deals with underperformance and encourages and spreads good practice. So local autonomy, school-based autonomy in a collaborative environment is really important. I want to show you some data from our analysis on that. If you are operating an education system that has no shared policy in a subject like mathematics or science, you can actually see how school autonomy works against you. It's actually the more autonomous schools that do worse than the less autonomous schools. But if you operate in a context where there is a clear understanding of what good performance is, where there is intervention when things go wrong, you can actually see how school autonomy becomes a predictor for success. So, giving schools more discretion, more room for maneuver is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for improvement. And again, I think that's a lesson for England, for the UK. A lot of focus has gone on strengthening initiative. More is needed to build a stronger system around schools to spread good practice. It's very easy to get good practice into a classroom. It's much, much harder to get good practice out of a classroom into the system. Very few education systems do that really, really well. You can go to Shanghai in China, where there's a lot of peer learning, a lot of collaboration among teachers, among schools, incentivized by government, but you don't find many of those places in the world. So it's another point I want to make. What have been the drivers of change that we have seen? I want to order them by their impact on outcomes. Now, everybody wants to do the things that are important, but you also need to take into account the economic and political cost of educational reform. Everybody wants to do things that are easy to do and very important. Obviously, I call them the quick wins. Nobody wants to invest, things that are really hard to do and very expensive. But you need to move the frontier forward, do things that are very important, even if they are hard to do. And you can always pick up some low-hanging fruits, things that may be not so important, but that are easy to do. I want to sort of highlight a few areas that we have found to be actually very, very important in terms of driving outcomes, and I'm going to go through them one by one. The first sounds almost trivial, and that is to believe that every student actually can do reasonably well. Where can we learn that best from? East Asia. You can see that actually mirrored in the mindset of students. We once asked students, what do you think makes you successful in mathematics? And many students in England said, well, that's clear, that's all about talent. If I'm not a genius, I'm going to study something else. So the clear idea that the school is just sorting me, I'm not owning the success. You ask that same question to students in Singapore or China, and you get 9 out of 10 students telling you, if I try really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. And surprise, surprise, that's what you see in the results. Social background, none of this has an impact on learning outcomes. This is an education system that has given every student the message, there's no tolerance for failure, there's no apology for failure. We are here to help you to be successful. And that mindset is sort of easy to say, really hard to do, but it's one of the best predictors on learning outcomes anywhere in the world. And the important thing is you can create that. It is not a cultural attribute. There's an outcome of the way in which you structure education. Gateways and instructional system, and I think this is where I think in England, in the UK, most things are in place, reform of the examination system, the instructional system, and so on. It's very, very important, relatively easy to do. Often we tend to focus maybe too much on those aspects because they are so easy to do, but they are important. Capacity at the point of delivery, I put that higher. No? This is about leadership in the system, and I'm not talking just about principals, I'm talking leadership through every level of the system, from teachers up to the administration, building that kind of capacity. It's about teachers and so on. It's about incentive structures and accountability, again, relatively easy to do, sometimes a bit overestimated in terms of impact. Getting resources where they make most of a difference. I put this very high. In principle, it's also easy to do. This is about how you tie together the more successful with the least successful schools, how you attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classroom. Again, we can learn a lot from East Asia on this. If you are a vice principal in a high-performing school in Shanghai, and one day you ask yourself, I really want to become a principal, the system will tell you, well, that's a great ambition, but help us first turn around one of the lowest performing schools. So every career advancement goes through improvement. And that's just something I think we need to put attention to, and it's something that is closely associated with outcomes and results. So those are, and then of course, making sure that education systems learn. We expect students to learn, but what do we invest to keep teachers learning? No? You go to Singapore, 100 hours every year invested in every teacher. There's a lot of effort going into this and building capacity. How do they pay for this? With larger classes. No? So there's a lot of investment, keeping the system learning, and so on. And finally, making sure that things are coherent over time across the system and so on. That's at least, what our comparative analysis shows. I want to just sort of talk you through some of the barriers. Why are things so hard in education? I mean, one thing that we have to acknowledge is that the world around us, the demand for skills is changing much faster than the supply. This is true for most countries. One thing is that reform trajectories are simply complex and long. No? And I think if we were more honest to ourselves, how long is it going to take until we see real results? If we were better at communicating those reform trajectories to the consumers, we probably would see more sustained support for the kind of changes that we envisage. And I want to show you some of the traps that we often fall into. This is the data that shows you how much is being spent per student relative to spending capacity in education systems. So where the dots are high, there's a lot of investment. Where the dots are low, relatively less. No? But it becomes really interesting, how do countries make their investments in education? And that is much of what reform is really about. No? The Koreans are an interesting example. They put a lot of their resources in teacher salaries. No? They pay teachers really well in order to attract great people into the profession. But they don't stop there. They also buy a lot of instruction time. They want their students to study for many hours in school. That costs them more money. And they want one third thing. They want their teachers to learn. I mentioned that already. There's a lot of investment in Korea in making sure that teachers don't only teach, but they work with their colleagues. They prepare lessons. They study lessons. They go to continuing professional development. Nice to say, very expensive. You see that in the yellow bar. How does Korea pay for this? The answer is very large classes. No? They make a choice. Whenever we have to make a choice between a better teacher or a smaller class, we go for the better teacher. You go to the next country on the list, that's Luxembourg, and you can see Luxembourg spends as much money as Korea. The red dots are comparable. But in Luxembourg, parents and teachers all like small classes. No? So that's where all the money is gone. And this is a good example where resources through reform are invested in things that are very, very popular. No? You make yourself many friends as a politician and so on if you invest in smaller classes. That's been very expensive in Luxembourg, but even Luxembourg can spend its money only once. And the price for the small classes has been, limited instruction time, so-so teacher salaries, and teachers have no time to do anything else than teaching. I show you a couple of other countries. Finland and Sweden, neighboring countries, very similar in their lookout, very culturally similar. But they spent their money very differently. Look at this. Finland, in the way it spends its money, is almost like Korea, on the other side of the world. And Sweden, in the way it spends its money, is more similar to Luxembourg. And I think this tells us something, that those choices are not built by the context. These are policy choices. These are choices that people make for reasons. And actually, you look at this chart for long enough, you do more complex analysis, and you can find actually most countries that do well invest the primary resources in the quality of teachers and teaching. They pay for this, if necessary, with larger classes and so on. And that's not often popular, but one thing I think really to consider, if you want to change what happens in the classroom, deal with the large within-school variability of performance, that is probably an important part of the puzzle. Now, one thing people always tell me is, well, you know, it may be more effective to have larger classes and better teachers, but teachers don't like it. So actually, one of the things that we did at the OECD, we actually wanted to find out. We surveyed teachers. We did the largest ever study on teachers. And we asked them about their job satisfaction, and then we broke that down by class size. And actually, this is what we found, you know. We couldn't actually see any relationship between teacher job satisfaction and the size of the class into which they were teaching. What we could see is that there was a very strong relationship between the kind of disciplinary issues teachers encountered in the classroom. The more disruptive students you have in the class, the lower your job satisfaction. Well, you know, if we think about this in terms of educational reform, we'd be much better advised to invest in classroom management, in pedagogy, teacher capacity, than taking out numbers out of the class. But again, you know, this is what the evidence says, but it's not the most popular choice. And that's the point I wanted to make. We often get trapped in those things that are intuitive, that are very popular, not necessarily the kind of things that will yield the best outcomes. And again, this is something where we can learn from education systems that have a long-term view, they figure out what is important, and they pursue that consistently. Lack of evidence. Sometimes we are telling each other stories that are actually not really true. You know, I want to show you something here. Sweden has its own merit rating. You know, Sweden didn't have a kind of national exam, but every school was telling, you know, how well their students did. And since 2000, you know, things got better and better and better and better every year. And then comes PISA and other international assessments. They actually said things get worse in reading, in math, in science, in everything. But people don't see that. You know, people often look at metrics that are used to, that are very popular, that parents get from the students. And that is a big part of the problem. We are not incentivized to pursue change if we tell ourselves, we don't tell ourselves the truth. And I think the Swedish example is really stark in that sense, since there was no kind of absolute metric, you know, people just awarding their own grades by their own criteria. Everybody thought they were getting better, and things actually go worse. And I think this is a very important lesson too. Consumer perceptions. England has put a lot of emphasis on school choice. You put a lot on the shoulders of parents to make wise choices. Well, think about it for a moment. Unfortunately, I don't have data for England, but I show you data that are quite consistent across countries. This is the percentage of parents who's told us that high academic achievement is very, very important when they choose a school. And you can see in Korea and Chile and Portugal is up to 50%. Half of the parents, the privileged parents, the blue diamonds are a bit better than the less advantaged and so on. But overall, you get about half of the parents who think, up to half of the parents who think that high academic achievement is really very important. That's not very encouraging. You know, if you really want to use market forces to drive this, that's not enough. Actually, I give you a comparator. You know, a safe school environment is a lot more important to many parents than actually the academic results. And that is something I think we have to be aware. And again, one lesson for education reform you can take out from this is you can walk on choice mechanisms through demand, you know, asking parents to make wise choices. You get only that far. When you look at countries, particularly in East Asia, Hong Kong, you know, totally choice-based systems. The Netherlands, totally choice-based systems. Shanghai, largely choice-based systems. They put at least as much emphasis on managing competition through the supply side than through the demand side. They ask teachers to compete, schools to compete on intellectual criteria than just sort of moving through parental choice. And I think that's another lesson, I think, for reform I would take serious. Metrics of perceived quality often win over actual quality. This is an interesting point of data. On the horizontal axis, you find the share of principals who told us that more than 30% of their students come from disadvantaged backgrounds. No? Principals saying, my students come from disadvantage. On the vertical axis, you see the actual percentage of students coming from disadvantaged backgrounds. Here, lots of students in disadvantage, and lots of principals say there is disadvantage. So in Brazil, the world is in order somehow. No? But you look to the United States. No? Actually, it's a very wealthy country. There's not much disadvantage. But no country has more principals telling us that there's a large share of students in disadvantage. No? The counterexample is Singapore. You know, lots of students in disadvantage, or some, but actually few principals seeing that as a problem. And I think that also shows us sometimes, you know, this issue around social disadvantage becomes a construct in our minds that is not necessarily reflected in the reality. And I think this is very relevant in the English context as well, because our data actually show that, yes, social background is still a powerful divider, but not as powerful as some of you think. There's a lot of underperformance in very wealthy areas and some real successes in the more challenging areas. And these kind of issues is what we have to have in mind. If we don't give a realistic perception to parents, principals, and teachers of what the real challenges are, you get these kinds of distortions that you can see. It shows you, again, communication is so important in reform. This is sort of another illustration of the same point. Here I have marked student performance by decile of social background. You can see the poor kids in Mexico do worse than the wealthy kids. But if you are in Chile and you come from a poor background, you know, you do worse than if you come from Mexico. And then you look at this across countries, and you can see how much that varies. And you can see, you know, you put in Shanghai as a picture, and you can see the 10% of the most disadvantaged children in Shanghai. And they are kids from very poor families, from migrant families. Parents often have no background. They outperform or perform at a similar level than the 20% of children from the wealthiest backgrounds in the UK and other countries. And again, it shows us really how much we can achieve if the policies and practices are right on this. Last point, what can we do to actually make reform happen? And with this, I don't mean the design of reforms. That's the easy part. Well, what can we actually do for successful reform implementation? A couple of points I want to make here. One thing I have often heard, and I hear this many times in the UK, you know, all what the high-performing countries do is they get their teachers from the top third of the graduate distribution. You know? They just plug the teachers from the best graduates, and then they get everything done. I wanted to find out, and actually one of the things that we did with our survey of adult skills, we knew the graduate distribution of skills. And you can see that here in the blue bars. This is the middle half of the numeracy skills of college or university graduates. And you can see there is some variation. You know, college graduates in Japan and Finland are more highly skilled than college graduates in Poland and Italy. But that was not the question. The question was, you know, where do teachers come in? Well, let's have a look. This is where the teachers are. The first thing you can see, actually, there is not a single country which is able to attract the teachers from the top third of the graduate distribution. And it shouldn't surprise us. You know, everybody wants the top third graduates, the engineers, the finance people, everyone. But what you also see is in most countries, teachers are pretty normal people. No? They come from the center of the graduate distribution. If you are in Finland, okay, you know, they do very well, the graduates, and the teachers are coming from the frontier, so that's an advantage. But, you know, you go to Sweden, the graduates are highly skilled, but teaching is not very attractive. Teachers come rather from the bottom. No? You go to Poland, the graduates are not very skilled, and the teachers come from the lower end of the performance spectrum. But you then think about the first slide. No? Poland is one of the most rapidly improving education systems. And that teaches us, getting the right people is an advantage, but actually what you do with those teachers in your education system is far more predictive for learning outcomes. And that's very encouraging for reform, because it actually means you can invest in teachers, do something with them, rather than just waiting for the next generation of teachers, not waiting for a spaceship that one day is going to bring you a new generation of teachers. That's often what we see in reform. I think it's a very encouraging picture. And again, if you look at the UK, at England, actually, again, teachers are pretty much from the average teacher. So message here really is, initial recruitment, initial selection is very important. Nobody denies that. But actually what you do with your teachers, the kind of work organization you provide, the level of continued support, that matters by a large margin more. I want to show you just a couple of things on that. We ask teachers actually, where do they want to learn? Their needs for professional development. And this is the average. The blue bar, you can teaching students with special needs comes first. Technology, all those kinds of things is where teachers feel a bit insecure. Knowledge of the subjects and curriculum is sort of a lot lower on that. Where does England come in? The first thing that strikes you is that the bars are all shorter. Now, what does that tell us? Does it mean, English teachers are the best, they don't need any more professional development, or are the ambitions lower? It's not so clear from this data. No? Or is the provision worse? Is the kind of professional development accessible to teachers not really such that they think that's going to help me to become a better teacher? What is interesting, to put this in context, Japan and Korea come out on top. You look at international assessments, these teachers must be doing something right because their students do so well, but still they want to become better. They really have this idea, I want to become a better teacher. You see the same thing when you look at pedagogical competences. 30% of Korean teachers say, I want to become better in pedagogy. I want to do more. 2% in England. Or knowledge of the curriculum. Again, English teachers telling us, thank you, I know everything I need to know. In Korea, you have 25% of the teachers wanting to do more. It's not so clear what exactly that tells us. It could be the provision, the quality of provision. It could be the aspiration of teachers. It could be the quality of teachers. We do not know, but it tells you a story that actually, the aspiration of people to develop, to improve their own knowledge is an important factor in reform. Collaboration. You compare medicine and you see how basically in the 1950s a surgeon could solve most of the problems on their own. Today they work in a highly technological environment with lots of other people and so on. And that change is one that we haven't seen really in the classroom. And actually our data supports it very much. Actually, we looked at teacher self-efficacy, the belief of teachers actually to become better teachers. And you can see actually the more frequently you teach as a team in the class, the more teachers feel they are effective teachers. The more they observe other teachers' classrooms, the more they feel they are better teachers. The more they engage in joint activities, take part in collaborative professional development. All those things seem to be very, very closely related to the perception of teachers to be effective. And remember, the challenge in England lies not between schools, but within schools. Professional autonomy in a collaborative culture seems to be one of the keys that our data suggests are really an important lever for reform. If this is so important, if collaboration is so important, how well do systems do in this? And actually, this shows you some data on this. And here you have the data for England. When you think about exchange and coordination, you see there's a lot of things going on in schools. Teachers are very social people, they talk with other people, exchange information. But when it comes to the deep kind of professional collaboration that I was talking about, you actually see how rarely that happens. There's some variation across countries. You can see, for example, in countries like Japan, Denmark, and so on, there's a lot more team teaching. In Israel and Singapore, you can find more collaborative professional development, joint activities, but classroom observation, for example, lesson study. We know from data how important it is, how much impact that can have on behavior, and we know this from teachers themselves. And then you can see, that's just about 10%, 1 in 10 teachers who do that at least once per month. And these are things, with reform we could easily address. We could provide an environment that incentivizes, encourages more collaboration within the school, across schools, building more powerful networks. And that's exactly what you can see in a country like Shanghai, or a place like Shanghai. They have a very simple digital platform where teachers share their lesson plans. And the more other people comment on your lesson, criticize your lesson, improve your lesson, use your lesson, the more popular you become in the system. And at the end of the school year, when you're evaluated by your principal will ask you not, how well did you teach your students only. They will also ask you, what contribution did you make to the improvement of the education system? How well are you known in the system? So actually, very simple devices, but very powerful to actually create a collaborative environment and create more opportunities for teachers to compete and collaborate. Space for reform. I'm going to skip that. We have the same effect on feedback and appraisal. Teachers often, some people say teachers complain about teacher evaluation. Actually, teachers told us the opposite. Most teachers do not complain about too much appraisal and too much evaluation, but that they get too little feedback that is meaningful for their own improvement. They feel very much operating in isolation in the classroom. Focusing efforts on this can be very, very powerful. I'm not going to go through this data in detail. I just want to sort of highlight one last point. If I can go through this quickly. I'm going to skip that as well, because we're running out of time. How can we make reform happen? The idea of innovation is very, very important, getting good ideas out of the classroom. If you compare education with health, health spends about 15 times as much on research and innovation than education does. We do not have that culture yet. And also in health, it's the practitioners, the teachers, that actually are the innovators, the researchers. In education, we do that in some university. I think that's very, very important, getting innovation from practitioners into this, getting innovation from users, getting a clearer sense of what users are looking for, and finally, having more entrepreneurial development of products and services. We dump a lot of technology in classrooms today, but we have very little in terms of a strategy. Now, when you talk about reform, that's something I think worth to look at. How can we build a more strategic, longer-term view to the use of technology? Making the costs and benefits of educational innovation and reform as symmetric as you can is hard. Everybody wants innovation and reform except for their own child. So that getting that dynamic right is important. The benefits of reform, the winners are often insufficient. The people who gain will not stand up. They think that's great, I have paid my taxes for this. But the people who pay the costs for reform are usually very vocal. And to get that balance right is very, very important. And that means basically consistent, coordinated efforts to make sure that those people who are affected by reforms understand the need for it. Getting teachers involved in the design of reforms rather than just at the stage of implementation is so critical for actually making reform happen. Nobody likes change and reform. Everybody will always value the status quo. That's a very natural way of people's behavior. So being good at communicating the need for change, building support for change, not just among those who are the providers, but actually who are the users, helping parents understand, investing in capacity development. Very, very critical. I think we can learn a lot of lessons from the United States over the last years. Great reforms. Really, I think things that could have moved the system by a large margin further, but little investment in capacity, and that led to enormous frustration. It threatens actually some of the reforms actually to turn them backwards. So those are the kind of lessons I wanted to share with you. Thank you very much.